So first I'm going to talk about some of the stability and changes that are happening in middle adulthood. We'll look a little bit at personality, which we haven't discussed too much in this class, and talk about some of the changes that happen in personality through middle adulthood and also some of the things that stay stable. Then we'll look at some of the relationships in middle adulthood. One of the key relationships that often develops during this time is grandparenthood, so having a relationship with grandchildren. And then we'll finish by talking a little bit about changes in career and retirement. So the conflict that Erikson proposed happens during this stage of middle adulthood is referred to as generativity versus stagnation. Generativity is basically the sense of wanting to give and guide the next generation. That is sometimes done through parenthood. That's kind of the most common way that people reach generativity, but it can be done through all types of other relationships. But really the idea of generativity is extending commitments beyond the self and your intimate partner. So up until this stage, through early adulthood, there's been a lot of focus on developing your own identity, developing your career, developing a relationship with a spouse or significant other. And so it's during this time that you shift away from that and your focus is more on the next generation. It requires integrating personal goals with social welfare. And like I said, it can be realized through parenting, but there's also other sources. So other family relationships can give a sense of generativity. If you don't have your own children, then maybe taking care of nieces or nephews, for example, can provide that sense. Work is often a good place. If, people may mentor new employees at their work environment, and that's one way to facilitate that generativity. Also things like volunteering, mentoring outside of work, developing creative and productive lines of work can also lead to that sense of generativity. If someone does not reach generativity, then they may fall on the side of stagnation, which is essentially a failure to contribute to the development of the next generation. It's usually driven by a more sort of self-centered, self-indulgent, self-absorbed view of the world. So maybe in middle adulthood, instead of looking to the next generation, someone kind of continues to turn inwards and really only focus on themselves. They may have a lack of interest in young people and in the next generation. They may have really negative views of young people and the next generation. And they tend to focus on what they can get from others instead of focusing more on what they can give or provide. They also may have little interest in being productive at work or developing their talents. Sometimes this generativity versus stagnation is referred to as the midlife crisis. You all have probably heard that term before, that people go through a midlife crisis. A lot of the stereotypes, though, that are associated with the midlife crisis, like if you picture, I don't know, like when I think midlife crisis, I think of some guy in his 50s in like a sports car, like dating younger women, right? All those sort of stereotypes you associate with it. Most of those have not been shown to be true through actual research and evidence. And so that's kind of a misconception, the sort of the view that we have of midlife crisis. But the term midlife crisis came from Erikson's theories on generativity versus stagnation. During this time, there's often a shift in gender identity. So people in this midlife have a rise in what's called androgyny, which is basically adapting sort of roles from both genders. And so women tend to have an increase in masculine traits and men tend to have an increase in feminine traits during this midlife period. So for example, women may become sort of more dominant in their workplace. They may become more vocal and assertive than they were previously. Men may become more sensitive and emotional. They may become more caring and dependent than they were in their younger years. That's typically historically been true. However, recent cohorts have shown less change towards androgyny compared to previous generations. However, that might be due to the fact that recent cohorts are more likely to have androgynous traits earlier on. So whenever they're younger, they're more likely to sort of adapt, masculine traits if they're a female and feminine traits if they're a male. And so there's not as much room for change for recent cohorts as there was for previous cohorts. It's been shown, though, that having this more androgynous approach during middle adulthood is associated with better psychological health. And it may come from the need to sort of adapt to some of the changes that people go through during this time. So during midlife is when people often will have, their career is growing, they may have increased pressure from their job, they may be launching their children, which I'll talk about in a little bit, so their children, graduate from high school and move away. All of those may create challenges and changes that sort of force the person to take on a more rounded approach to life that leads to this androgyny. It also has been shown to increase creativity, advance moral reasoning, and psychosocial maturity to sort of take on roles from the opposite gender. So one of the topics we haven't touched on too much in this class is the Big Five personality traits. I don't think I've talked about it at all actually in this class. You may have heard of this, sometimes referred to as like the ocean, or some people call it CNU. It's an acronym to sort of address all of these 5 personality traits. And the 5 personality traits are neuroticism. That's essentially a tendency to worry, to be anxious. People who are high in neuroticism are often emotional and really vulnerable. There's extroversion, which someone who's high in extroversion is very sociable, outgoing. They tend to be more passionate and kind of fun-loving than people who are lower in extroversion. Openness to experience is, that personality trait is associated with like curiosity. It's basically what it sounds like, a willingness to experience new things beyond what you've done before. Agreeableness is someone who's high in that trait tends to be really soft-hearted and trusting, really sort of good-natured, gets along well with other people. Conscientiousness refers to sort of like a hard-working, people who are high in conscientiousness tend to be really punctual and organized. So those are the big 5 personality traits that have been proposed by a lot of researchers as being kind of the core of personality. Personality is something that's supposed to be stable across the lifetime. However, there are some changes in these big 5 during middle adulthood. So, for example, there often are increases in both agreeableness and conscientiousness. So you sort of raise higher in those traits through middle adulthood. And typically people in middle adulthood tend to have decreases in neuroticism. So you have some kind of changes and shifts in those personality traits. They are somewhat stable, so someone who's really high in neuroticism, may decrease a little bit during midlife, but probably not a lot. And this is responsive to pressures of life, so things that happen. So for example, it's been shown that people who are in a stable relationship, who have good relationships with their children and their spouses, tend to have more increases in agreeableness and conscientiousness. And career changes, things like that, can also maybe drive some changes in these personality traits. So for example, you may get into a career where it's really important to network and socialize with other people, and that may lead to an increase in extroversion. So overall, these traits tend to be fairly stable, but there are some changes and shifts that happen during middle adulthood in these personality traits.